Welcome to the channel. Today's story takes us back to 1811, to one of the most powerful and erased uprisings in American history. We follow Charles Destrehan, a slave driver who led 500 enslaved people in a march for freedom from the massive Destrehan Plantation, only to face a brutal and forgotten end. His name was nearly wiped from the record, but not today. So, please take a moment, breathe, and listen closely. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive and remembered. Let's begin. The night air hung thick and heavy over the Louisiana sugar fields on January 8, 1811. Just beyond the levee, the Mississippi River turned dark and restless. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out across the cane fields, and in the slave quarters of the Enslaved Plantation, located in what is now La Place, Louisiana, a man named Charles Destrehan made a decision that would change American history forever. He was 31 years old. His entire life had been spent watching men and women work to death in the cane fields. He had seen children ripped from their mothers' arms and sold down river to plantations, where they would never see their families again. He had witnessed beatings so brutal that grown men begged for death. And on this night, Charles Destrehan decided that enough was enough. What happened over the next 72 hours would become the largest slave revolt in the history of the United States. It would terrify the white planter class to their very core. It would shake the foundations of the American slave system. And then, systematically and deliberately, it would be erased from history. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. To understand what happened on that January night, you first have to understand the world that created Charles Destrehan. You have to understand a place called the German coast. The German coast was a stretch of land running along the east bank of the Mississippi River, approximately 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. The name came from German immigrants who had settled there in the 1720s. But by 1811, the region had transformed into something far more sinister. It had become the sugar capital of North America. Sugar was liquid gold. It was more valuable than cotton, more profitable than tobacco, and it was produced through a system of labor so brutal, so dehumanizing, that it defied comprehension. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were death factories, plain and simple. The work was backbreaking, the hours were endless, and the mortality rate among enslaved workers was staggering. During harvest season, which ran from October through December, enslaved people worked around the clock. They cut cane with heavy machetes under the blazing Louisiana sun. They fed the cut stalks into grinding mills that could crush a man's arm to pulp in seconds. They boiled the extracted juice in massive kettles, heated to temperatures that could melt flesh from bone. One moment of exhaustion, one slip of concentration, and you were dead, or worse, you were maimed and still expected to work. The plantation owners knew exactly what they were doing. They calculated the cost of purchasing new enslaved people against the cost of treating existing ones humanely. And time after time, they reached the same conclusion: it was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than it was to provide adequate food, rest, and medical care. This was not cruelty born of passion or rage. This was cruelty born of economics. Cold, calculated, systematic destruction of human life in pursuit of profit. By 1811, enslaved black people outnumbered white residents on the German coast by nearly 5 to 1. On some plantations, the ratio was even more extreme. This demographic reality haunted the dreams of every planter in the region. They knew they were surrounded. They knew that the people they brutalized every single day had every reason in the world to rise up and destroy them. And they knew that if the enslaved population ever organized, ever found leadership, ever stopped being afraid, the consequences would be catastrophic. They were right to be afraid. Charles Deslandes was not born a revolutionary. He was born into slavery, likely on the Deslandes plantation owned by the widow of Jacques Deslandes. Some historians believe he was the son of a white man and an enslaved woman, which would have given him certain privileges within the brutal hierarchy of plantation life. He became a slave driver, a position that placed him between the white overseers and the field hands. He had authority. He had mobility. He could move between plantations without raising suspicion. And most importantly, he had access. But Charles Deslandes was also a man who carried within him the memory of revolution. The territory of Orleans, which would become the state of Louisiana in 1812, had received thousands of refugees from the Haitian Revolution in the years before the uprising. Between 1809 and 1810 alone, approximately 3,000 free and enslaved black people arrived in Louisiana from Saint Domingue by way of Cuba. They brought with them stories of what had happened on that Caribbean island. They brought tales of how enslaved people had risen up, defeated the most powerful armies in Europe, and created the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The white planters of Louisiana lived in constant terror of what they called Another Saint Domingue. They implemented strict laws to control the movement of enslaved people. They banned the importation of slaves from the Caribbean. They created elaborate systems of surveillance and punishment designed to crush any hint of resistance before it could spread. But they could not stop people from talking. They could not stop the stories from spreading through the slave quarters at night. They could not stop men like Charles Deslandes from dreaming of freedom. The planning for the uprising likely took months. Charles Deslandes moved from plantation to plantation, speaking in whispers, recruiting men who were ready to fight. He built a network of conspirators that stretched across multiple parishes. He identified leaders who could command smaller groups of fighters. He stockpiled weapons where he could find them, and he waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came on the night of January 8, 1811. The Andre Plantation was one of the largest in St. John the Baptist parish. Manuel Andre was a wealthy planter who owned dozens of enslaved people. He was also the commandant of the local militia, which made his plantation a symbolic target. To strike at Andre was to strike at the very heart of white power in the region. The attack began sometime after dark. Charles Deslandes led a group of approximately 15 to 25 enslaved men toward the main house. They were armed with cane knives, axes, and clubs. They carried no firearms. They had no training in military tactics. What they had was rage. What they had was desperation. What they had was a burning desire to be free. Manuel Andre was in his home when the rebels struck. The enslaved men broke into the house and attacked him with axes and knives. They wounded him severely, leaving gashes across his body that would scar him for life. But Andre managed to escape. He fled into the darkness, bleeding and terrified, and made his way to a neighboring plantation to raise the alarm. His son, Gilbert Andre, was not so fortunate. The rebels found him and killed him. The young man became one of only 2 white people who would die during the entire uprising. His death sent a message that echoed across the German coast. The enslaved were fighting back, and they were not asking for mercy. With the Andre Plantation secured, Charles Deslandes led his growing army onto the river road. This was the main thoroughfare connecting the plantations of the German coast to New Orleans. It ran along the levee, following the curves of the Mississippi River, through some of the richest agricultural land in North America. And, on this night, it became the path of revolution. As the rebels marched, they stopped at plantation after plantation. At each stop, They called out to the enslaved people in the quarters. Some joined immediately, grabbing whatever weapons they could find and falling into the growing column of fighters. Others hung back, afraid of what would happen if the revolt failed. The rebels did not force anyone to join. They simply offered a choice of freedom or slavery, fight or remain in chains. Hundreds chose to fight. The column grew as it moved downriver. Estimates vary widely, but by the time the rebel army reached its full strength, it numbered somewhere between 200 and 500 men. They marched to the beat of drums. They carried flags and banners. They organized themselves into units with designated leaders on horseback. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. This was a military operation planned and executed with remarkable discipline, considering the circumstances. As they marched, the rebels set fire to the plantation houses and sugar mills of their former masters. The flames lit up the night sky, visible for miles in every direction. White families fled in terror, abandoning their homes and possessions, running toward New Orleans, or hiding in the swamps behind their properties. For the first time in their lives, the planters knew what it felt like to be hunted. They knew what it felt like to be powerless. They knew what it felt like to be afraid. The Destrehan Plantation stood directly in the path of the rebel advance. It was one of the oldest and most prestigious estates on the German coast, owned by Jean Destrehan, one of the most powerful men in Louisiana. The plantation house had been built between 1787 and 1790, constructed by an enslaved craftsman named Charles Packet. The irony was not lost on anyone. Enslaved hands had built the very symbols of their oppression. And now enslaved hands were burning them to the ground. 17 enslaved people from the Destrehan Plantation joined the revolt. Among them were men named Gros Lindor, Petit Lindor, and Jasmine. Gros and Petit Lindor were both 30 years old. Jasmine was 45. These were not young hotheads acting on impulse. These were mature men who had lived their entire lives in bondage, who had seen everything the plantation system had to offer, and who had decided that death in pursuit of freedom was preferable to another day in chains. Jean Destrehan himself was not at the plantation when the rebels passed through. He would later play a very different role in this story. But on the night of January 8th and into the morning of January 9th, the Destrehan Plantation was just another stop on the road to New Orleans. The rebel army continued its march through the night and into the next day. They moved through the present-day towns of Mons, Norco, and New Sarpy. They passed Destrehan and continued towards St. Rose. Their ultimate destination was New Orleans itself, the largest city in the territory, the seat of American power in the region. If they could take New Orleans, they would control the entire lower Mississippi Valley. They would have access to weapons, ammunition, and supplies. They would have a base from which to expand their revolution, and they would inspire enslaved people across the entire South to rise up and join them. The news of the uprising spread faster than the rebels could march. White refugees poured into New Orleans, bringing stories of fire and death on the German coast. The city erupted in panic. Governor William C. Claiborne, the territorial governor appointed by President James Madison, immediately declared martial law. He called up the militia and requested assistance from the regular United States Army forces stationed in the region. Claiborne was a Virginia-born politician who had been struggling to maintain control over Louisiana since the territory was purchased from France in 1803. The French Creole planters distrusted him. The Spanish residents resented him. And now the enslaved population was rising up to destroy everything he was supposed to protect. If the revolt succeeded, Claiborne's career was over. His reputation was finished, and quite possibly, he would be dead. The response was swift and overwhelming. General Wade Hampton, a wealthy plantation owner from South Carolina who commanded military forces in the region, assembled a combined force of militia, regular Army troops, and Navy sailors. By some estimates, nearly 700 armed white men mobilized to crush the rebellion. They had muskets, rifles, pistols, and cannons. They had horses, supplies, and military training. They had everything the rebels lacked. The two forces met near the plantation of Jacques Fortier on January 10, 1811. The rebels were exhausted after 2 days of marching and fighting. They were still armed primarily with hand tools. They had no defensive positions, no artillery, no cavalry to match the mounted troops arrayed against them. And yet they stood their ground and fought. The battle was short and brutally one-sided. The militia opened fire with muskets and rifles. The rebels charged with their cane knives and axes, trying to close the distance, trying to bring the fight to hand combat where their numbers might matter. But the white troops kept their discipline. They maintained their formations. They poured volley after volley into the advancing black fighters. Between 40 and 45 rebels died in the initial engagement. Many more were wounded. The survivors scattered. Some fleeing into the swamps behind the plantations, others trying to make their way back upriver to the places they had come from. The organized military phase of the revolt was over. It had lasted less than 48 hours. But the killing was just beginning. Charles Deslandes escaped the battlefield. He fled into the swamps with a handful of other survivors, hoping to disappear into the wetlands that the white troops feared to enter. But he was betrayed on January 11th. Militia forces led by Manuel Andry, the same man who had barely survived the initial attack on his plantation, tracked Deslandes down in the marshes behind the Picot and Trudeau plantations. What happened next was not an arrest. It was not a capture. It was an execution designed to send a message of terror that would echo through the enslaved population for generations. According to Samuel Hambleton, a naval officer who witnessed the aftermath, Charles Deslandes was taken alive, but was not granted the dignity of a trial or even a quick death. His hands were chopped off. Then he was shot in the legs, first one thigh and then the other, until both limbs were shattered and useless. Then he was shot in the torso, and then, before he had finished dying, he was thrown into a bundle of straw and burned alive. His screams carried across the swamps. They were meant to be heard. They were meant to terrorize the other escaped rebels still hiding in the marshes. They were meant to demonstrate what happened to black men who dared to dream of freedom. But the white authorities were not satisfied with killing Charles Deslandes. They wanted revenge. They wanted to make an example so horrifying that no enslaved person in Louisiana would ever think of rising up again. They wanted to break the spirit of an entire people. Over the following days, the militia hunted down every rebel they could find. They killed many without any pretense of legal proceedings. They shot men in the fields, in the swamps, in the quarters where they had tried to hide. They showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. The German coast became a killing field, and the bodies of black men littered the landscape. Those who were captured alive were not much more fortunate. The territorial government organized 3 separate tribunals to try the accused rebels. One was held in St. John the Baptist Parish, one was held in New Orleans, and one was held at the Destrehan Plantation, in the very shadow of the great house that enslaved hands had built. Jean Nogle Destrehan, the owner of the plantation, was appointed to the tribunal by Judge Pierre Bochet St. Martin. He would sit in judgment of men who had worked his own fields, who had grown his own sugar, who had made his own fortune through their labor. Among the accused were Gros Lindor, Petit Lindor, and Jasmine, the 3 men from his own plantation who who had joined the revolt. They had watched him grow rich from their suffering. Now he would decide whether they lived or died. The trial at the Destrehan Plantation began on January 13, 1811. It was not a trial in any meaningful sense of the word. There were no defense attorneys. There was no presumption of innocence. There was no opportunity for appeal. The tribunal consisted entirely of white planters, men who had every reason to want the accused dead, and no reason to show mercy. The outcome was never in doubt. The proceedings were recorded by Judge St. Martin. The accused were brought before the tribunal one by one. Some testified against their fellow rebels, hoping to save their own lives by betraying their comrades. Others refused to speak at all, defying the all-white tribunal with their silence. Still others admitted their participation freely, showing no remorse, expressing no regret. They had fought for freedom. They would die for it. The Destrehan tribunal convicted 21 men. 18 were sentenced to death by firing squad. Among those executed were Gross Lindor, Petit Lindor, and Jasmine, the 3 men who had left Jean Noble Destrehan's plantation to join the fight. But death was not the final indignity. After the executions, the bodies of the condemned were decapitated. Their heads were placed on poles and displayed along the levee, from the Destrehan Plantation all the way upriver to where the revolt had begun. For nearly 60 miles, the heads of black revolutionaries stared down at the people they had tried to free. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you resist. This is the price of dreaming. One witness described the sight in a letter that has survived to this day. Their heads decorate our levee all the way up the coast. I am told they look like crows sitting on long poles. By the end of January 1811, approximately 95 black men had been killed. Some died in battle. Some were hunted down and murdered in the swamps. Some were executed after their sham trials. Their bodies were mutilated, displayed, and left to rot in the Louisiana sun, as a warning to anyone who might think of following in their footsteps. The German coast uprising was over. The largest slave revolt in American history had been crushed in less than a week, and now began the long process of making sure that no one would ever remember it had happened at all. The territorial legislature moved quickly to compensate the planters for their losses. They approved payments of $300 for each enslaved person killed or executed during the suppression of the revolt. This was not justice. This was a business transaction. The planters had lost property, the government reimbursed them. The dead were reduced to line items on a ledger, their lives valued only in terms of the labor they could no longer provide. The newspapers covered the uprising, but their coverage was designed to minimize its significance. They portrayed the rebels as bandits and brigands, criminals motivated by greed rather than freedom. They emphasized the restraint and heroism of the white militia. They downplayed the size of the revolt and the threat it had posed. They created a narrative in which the uprising was a minor disturbance, easily handled, quickly forgotten. This narrative was not accidental. The white planter class understood that the story of the German coast uprising was dangerous. It demonstrated that enslaved people could organize across multiple plantations. It showed that they could plan sophisticated military operations. It proved that they were willing to fight and die for their freedom. And most dangerously of all, it suggested that, under different circumstances, they might actually win. If enslaved people across the South learned the true story of what had happened in Louisiana, they might be inspired to try again. They might learn from the mistakes Charles Deslandes had made. They might wait for a better moment, gather more weapons, build stronger alliances. The German coast uprising could become not a cautionary tale, but a blueprint. So the story was suppressed. It was minimized in official records. It was left out of history books. It was forgotten by white America, which had every reason to forget, and it was remembered only in whispered stories passed down through generations of black families. Stories of ancestors who had refused to accept their chains, who had fought back against impossible odds, who had died standing on their feet rather than live on their knees. For more than 2 centuries, the German Coast Uprising remained one of America's best-kept secrets. Other slave revolts became famous: Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia in 1800, Denmark Vesey's Conspiracy in South Carolina in 1822, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831. These events were studied in schools, analyzed by historians, remembered in the national consciousness. But the largest slave revolt of them all, the one that fielded an army of up to 500 men, the one that burned plantations for 30 miles along the Mississippi River, the one that terrified the entire planter class of the Lower South. That revolt was systematically erased from history, and the erasure was deliberate. The men who died at the Destrehan Plantation and along the German coast did not die in vain. Their sacrifice echoed through the decades that followed, inspiring future generations of freedom fighters, even when their names had been forgotten. The fear they instilled in the hearts of slaveholders contributed to the paranoid, repressive atmosphere that would eventually make the slave system unsustainable. And their courage demonstrated that the human spirit cannot be permanently crushed, no matter how brutal the oppression. Today, the Destrehan Plantation still stands. Visitors can tour the great house and walk the grounds where enslaved people once labored. There is an exhibit about the 1811 uprising, a small museum in a converted slave cabin that tells the story of Charles Deslandes and the men who followed him. But for most of its history, the Destrehan Plantation marketed itself as a glimpse into the gracious antebellum South, with its architecture and family histories taking center stage, while the reality of slavery remained in the shadows. This is the story of the German Coast Uprising. This is the story of Charles Deslandes and the hundreds of men who marched with him toward New Orleans. This is the story of what happened when enslaved people refused to accept their fate, when they organized and fought back, when they chose death over bondage. And this is the story of how America tried to forget. The sun rose over the German coast on the morning of January 11th, 1811, and it illuminated a landscape of devastation. Smoke still curled from the ruins of plantation houses and sugar mills. The charred remains of buildings dotted the riverbank for miles, and in the fields, in the swamps, along the muddy roads, the bodies of black men lay where they had fallen. But for the white planters of Louisiana, the killing was not over. It had barely begun. The 3 tribunals that convened in the days following the uprising were not courts of law. They were instruments of terror. The men who sat in judgment had already decided the fate of every accused rebel before the first witness was called. The only question was how many would die and how spectacularly their deaths would be displayed. At the Destrehan Plantation, the tribunal assembled on January 13, 1811. Judge Pierre Bochet St. Martin presided over the proceedings. He was joined by Jean Noble Destrehan, the owner of the plantation, and several other prominent planters from the region. These were men who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved workers. These were men who had lived in constant fear of exactly the kind of uprising that had just swept through their parishes. And these were men who were determined to ensure that nothing like it ever happened again. Accused were brought before the tribunal in chains. They had been captured in the swamps, in the fields, in the quarters where they had tried to hide. Some bore the wounds of battle. Others showed signs of the beatings they had received during their capture. All of them knew they were going to die. The only uncertainty was how much they would suffer before the end. The tribunal heard testimony from witnesses who had seen the rebels marching down the river road. They heard from enslaved people who had been forced to testify against their own comrades. They heard from white planters who demanded vengeance for their burned property and their wounded pride. But they did not hear from anyone who spoke in defense of the accused. There was no one to speak for them. There was no one who dared. Jean Nogle Destrehan sat in that room and looked into the eyes of men he had known for years. Gross Lindor had worked his fields. Padet Lindor had harvested his cane. Jasmine had labored under the Louisiana sun to make Destrehan rich beyond imagination. These were not strangers. These were men whose faces Destrehan had seen every day of his adult life. And now he would condemn them to death. What passed through his mind in those moments? Did he feel a flicker of guilt, a moment of hesitation? Did he wonder, even briefly, whether the system he profited from might be fundamentally wrong? We will never know. The historical record tells us only what he did, not what he felt. And what he did was vote to execute 18 human beings. The executions were carried out by firing squad. The condemned men were lined up and shot, their bodies jerking and falling as the musket balls tore through flesh and bone. But death was only the beginning of their punishment. The planters wanted more than dead bodies. They wanted symbols. They wanted warnings. They wanted to create images so horrifying that no enslaved person would ever forget them. The bodies of the executed rebels were decapitated. Their heads were removed with axes and knives, severed from their shoulders, while the blood was still warm. And then those heads were placed on wooden poles and erected along the levee that ran beside the Mississippi River. Imagine it, a row of human heads stretching for nearly 60 miles, from the outskirts of New Orleans all the way upriver to where the revolt had begun. The heads of fathers and sons, the heads of brothers and friends, the heads of men who had dreamed of freedom and paid for that dream with everything they had. The heads were positioned so that they faced the slave quarters of the plantations they passed. Every morning when the enslaved workers walked to the fields, they would see those heads. Every evening, when they returned exhausted from their labor, they would see those heads. The message was clear. This is what happens to rebels. This is what happens to those who resist. Look upon the faces of your brothers and remember. And the heads remained on display for weeks. The Louisiana winter was mild, but the bodies decomposed nonetheless. Crows and vultures gathered to feast on the rotting flesh. The empty eye sockets stared down at the living, a constant reminder of the price of resistance. Children who were too young to understand what had happened would carry these images with them for the rest of their lives. Old men and women who had spent decades in bondage would see in those heads the death of every hope they had ever harbored. This was not punishment. This was psychological warfare. The planters understood that they could not physically restrain every enslaved person in Louisiana. They did not have enough chains, enough guards, enough guns. What they could do was create a climate of fear so overwhelming that resistance would become unthinkable. The heads on poles were meant to break something deep inside the enslaved population. They were meant to crush the very capacity for hope, and for a time, it worked. In the immediate aftermath of the German coast uprising, enslaved people on the German coast became even more submissive, even more compliant, even more careful to hide any sign of discontent. The planters congratulated themselves on having solved the problem. They believed they had demonstrated once and for all the futility of resistance. But they were wrong. The heads on poles sent another message, too, a message the planters never intended. They told every enslaved person in Louisiana that the system feared them. The system was afraid. The system recognized that enslaved people had the power to organize, to fight, to threaten everything the planters had built. The very brutality of the response revealed the fragility at the heart of the slave system. If slavery were truly natural, truly stable, truly supported by divine will and biological destiny, why would it require such extreme measures to maintain? The enslaved people of Louisiana understood this contradiction, even if they could not articulate it. They saw the fear behind the cruelty. They recognized the desperation behind the violence. And they remembered. They told stories to their children, and their children told stories to their children. And the memory of the German coast uprising passed down through generations. Even as the official histories tried to erase it, the trials in New Orleans followed a similar pattern to the one at Destrehan. 11 more men were convicted and executed in the city. 3 of them were publicly hanged in the Plaza de Armas, the central square of New Orleans, that would later be renamed Jackson Square. The hangings were designed as public spectacles, meant to demonstrate the power of white authority and the consequences of black resistance. But even in this theater of death, there were moments that revealed something deeper about the human spirit. One of those condemned to die was a 13-year-old boy. He was too young to execute, the tribunal decided, but not too young to terrorize. They forced him to watch as another man was killed in front of him. And then they gave him 30 lashes with a whip, scarring his back for life. He would carry those scars as a reminder of what he had witnessed, of what he had survived, of what his elders had tried to accomplish. Did that boy grow up to resist? Did he pass down the story of what he had seen to his own children? Did the memory of the uprising live on in his family for generations? We do not know his name. We do not know what became of him. He is one of countless individuals whose stories have been lost to history, whose lives were deemed unworthy of recording, whose struggles and sufferings left no trace in the official documents. But we know he existed. We know he watched a man die for the crime of wanting to be free. And we know that he was marked, body and soul, by what happened in January 1811. In the weeks following the suppression of the revolt, the territorial legislature of Orleans met to consider the implications of what had occurred. The planters were shaken. They had come closer to catastrophe than they wanted to admit. If the rebels had been better armed, if they had managed to reach New Orleans before the militia was organized, if they had received support from free black people in the city, or from foreign powers like Spain or Britain, the outcome might have been very different. The legislature responded by passing new and harsher slave control laws. They increased restrictions on the movement of enslaved people. They banned assemblies and gatherings. They required more stringent supervision of slave quarters. They created new punishments for any hint of insubordination. The legal framework of slavery became even more oppressive, even more comprehensive, even more designed to crush the human spirit. But the legislature also did something else. They authorized compensation payments to planters who had lost enslaved property during the revolt, $300 for each enslaved person killed or executed. This was a significant sum in 1811, roughly equivalent to a year's wages for a skilled worker. The payments served multiple purposes. They reimbursed planters for their financial losses. They reinforced the idea that enslaved people were property rather than human beings. And they created a financial incentive for the brutal suppression of any future uprisings. Think about what this means. The men who had given their lives for freedom, who had marched toward New Orleans, with nothing but cane knives and courage, who had died under musket fire or been executed after sham trials. were reduced in death to line items on a government ledger. Their masters received cash payments for their loss. The rebellion had cost the planters money, and the government made them whole. The humanity of the rebels was denied even in death. This was the world that Charles Deslandes had tried to destroy. This was the system he had challenged with nothing but his will and his vision. He had failed, yes, but in failing, he had revealed something essential about that system. He had shown that it required constant violence to maintain. He had demonstrated that enslaved people were not the docile, contented workers that pro-slavery propaganda claimed. He had proven that the desire for freedom burned in the hearts of black men and women just as fiercely as it burned in anyone else. The planters understood this, even if they could never admit it publicly. In their private correspondence, in their personal diaries, they revealed their true feelings. They were afraid. They were always afraid. They knew that they lived on top of a volcano that could erupt at any moment. They knew that the people they brutalized every day had every reason to want them dead. And they knew that no amount of violence, no display of severed heads, no system of laws and punishments could ever make them truly safe. This fear shaped everything about Southern society in the decades that followed. It shaped the politics, the culture, the religion, the family structures. It created a world of constant surveillance and suspicion. It made the South into an armed camp, always ready for war against an enemy that lived within its borders. The ghost of Charles Deslandes haunted the dreams of slaveholders long after the heads on poles had rotted away. After the immediate crisis passed, the white authorities began the work of forgetting. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The official records were filed away and forgotten. The histories written in subsequent decades mentioned the uprising only in passing, if at all. When Louisiana became a state in 1812, just 1 year after the revolt, there was no mention of the hundreds of enslaved men who had marched toward New Orleans. It was as if they had never existed. This erasure was deliberate and systematic. The planters understood that the story of the German coast uprising was dangerous. It contradicted the central myth of American slavery, the idea that enslaved people were happy in their condition, grateful to their masters, incapable of organizing sophisticated resistance. If the true story of January 1811 became widely known, it would inspire other enslaved people to rise up. It would undermine the ideological foundations of the entire slave system. So the story was buried. It was left out of textbooks. It was omitted from commemorations. It was ignored by historians who had every opportunity to research and document what had occurred. For more than a century, the German coast uprising remained virtually unknown outside of the parishes where it had taken place. Meanwhile, other slave revolts received extensive coverage and analysis. Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in Charleston in 1822 was studied in detail, even though it was discovered before it could be carried out and resulted in no white deaths. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831 became one of the most famous events in American history, even though it involved fewer than 70 rebels and lasted only 2 days. These revolts were remembered because they fit a particular narrative. They could be portrayed as the work of deranged individuals, religious fanatics, or outside agitators. They could be used to justify increased repression without challenging the fundamental assumptions of the slave system. But the German coast uprising was different. It was too large to be dismissed as the work of a few malcontents. It was too well organized to be attributed to spontaneous violence. It demonstrated too clearly that enslaved people could create military structures, maintain discipline, and pursue strategic objectives. It showed that hundreds of enslaved men could unite across multiple plantations and multiple parishes, coordinating their actions and fighting as a cohesive force. This was the revolt that the slaveholders feared most, and this was the revolt that they worked hardest to forget. The Destrehan Plantation continued to operate in the decades after the uprising. Jean Noble Destrehan remained one of the most powerful men in Louisiana. He had briefly served as one of the first United States senators from the new state. Though he resigned after just a few months, he continued to prosper from the labor of enslaved people until his death. The blood he had helped spill in January 1811 did nothing to diminish his wealth or his status. But history has a way of rendering its own verdicts. Today, Jean Noble Destrehan is remembered primarily for his role in the suppression of the German Coast Uprising. His name is associated not with statesmanship or achievement, but with the brutal tribunals that condemned men to death for the crime of wanting to be free. The verdict he passed on those 18 men at the Destrehan Plantation has been reversed by the judgment of history. They are remembered as heroes. He is remembered as their executioner. The plantation itself passed through several hands in the years that followed. In 1839, it was purchased by Pierre Adolphe Rost, a justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court who had married another of Jean Noble Destrehan's daughters. Rost remodeled the house in the Greek Revival style that was fashionable at the time. He also continued to operate the plantation, using enslaved labor, maintaining the system that the German Coast Uprising had tried to destroy. When the Civil War came, Rost offered his services to the Confederacy. He was appointed as a diplomatic representative to Spain, where he spent most of the war trying to secure European recognition for the slaveholders' rebellion. He failed. The Confederacy fell, slavery was abolished, and the world that men like Rost and Destrehan had built came crashing down. After the war, the Destrehan Plantation became the site of something remarkable. The Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency created to assist formerly enslaved people in their transition to freedom, established a facility called the Ross Home Colony on the plantation grounds. Approximately 2,000 freed people received assistance at this location, learning to read and write, acquiring job skills, preparing for lives as free citizens. Think about the symbolism of this moment. The plantation where 18 men had been executed for seeking freedom became a place where freedom was nurtured and supported. The grounds where heads had been displayed on poles became a refuge for those building new lives after slavery. The great house that enslaved hands had built witnessed the transformation of enslaved people into free men and women. Charles Deslandes would have appreciated this irony. He would have recognized it as a vindication of everything he had fought for. The rebellion he led had failed in its immediate objectives, but the cause he championed had ultimately prevailed. Slavery was abolished. The planters were defeated. The system that had required such extreme violence to maintain was swept away by an even greater violence. The violence of a nation at war with itself. But victory came at a terrible cost, and it was incomplete. The end of slavery did not mean the end of white supremacy. The abolition of legal bondage did not bring true freedom to Black Americans. The decades that followed emancipation saw new systems of oppression arise to replace the old one as sharecropping, convict leasing, black codes, Jim Crow laws, lynching, voter suppression. These were the tools that white Southerners used to maintain their dominance after slavery was formally ended. The same mentality that had displayed heads on poles along the German coast continued to express itself in new forms. The same fear and hatred that had motivated the brutal suppression of the 1811 uprising continued to drive white violence against Black communities for more than a century afterward. The same determination to erase Black resistance from history continued to shape what was taught in schools and remembered in public commemorations. For most of the 20th century, the German coast uprising remained virtually unknown. Historians occasionally mentioned it in passing, but it received nothing like the attention given to Nat Turner or John Brown. The story was too dangerous, too challenging, too threatening to the comfortable narratives that white Americans told themselves about their history. It was not until scholars like Gwendolyn Midlo Hall began excavating the historical records in the late 20th century that the full scope of the uprising began to emerge. It was not until Daniel Rasmussen published his book, American Uprising, in 2011 that the story reached a wide popular audience. 200 years after Charles Deslandes led his army down the river road, America finally began to reckon with what he had done. Today, the German coast uprising is increasingly recognized as one of the most significant events in American history. It is studied in universities and discussed in documentaries. It has inspired novels, plays, and works of art. The African American History Alliance of Louisiana leads an annual commemoration each January, and descendants of participants in the revolt have joined these ceremonies to honor their ancestors. At the Destrehan Plantation, there is now an exhibit dedicated to the 1811 uprising. Visitors can learn about Charles Deslandes and the men who followed him. They can see the grounds where the tribunal met and the executions took place. They can walk the same paths that enslaved people walked 200 years ago. The plantation that once marketed itself as a glimpse into the gracious antebellum South now confronts the brutal reality of what that world actually was. But there is still work to be done. The story of the German coast uprising is still not taught in most American schools. Most Americans have never heard of Charles Deslandes. The largest slave revolt in United States history remains far less famous than smaller uprisings that have captured the popular imagination. Why does this matter? Why should we care about something that happened more than 200 years ago? Because the erasure of the German coast uprising was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of historical violence, an attempt to deny Black Americans their history of resistance. When we forget that enslaved people fought back, we accept the lie that they were passive victims. When we forget that hundreds of men marched toward New Orleans with dreams of freedom, we diminish the courage and determination that have always been part of the Black experience in America. Charles Deslandes was not a victim. He was a warrior. He was a leader. He was a man who looked at the world around him and decided that it was intolerable. He did not wait for someone else to save him. He did not hope that his masters would eventually develop a conscience. He took action. He organized. He fought. And when he was captured, he faced his death with a courage that his executioners could never understand. The men who followed him were not victims either. They were soldiers in a war for freedom. They knew the risks they were taking. They knew what would happen if they failed, and they chose to fight anyway. They chose death over slavery. They chose to stand on their feet rather than live on their knees. This is the legacy that was almost stolen from us. This is the history that powerful people worked very hard to erase. And this is why we must remember. The German coast uprising teaches us that resistance is always possible. It teaches us that courage can exist, even in the darkest circumstances. It teaches us that the human spirit cannot be permanently crushed, no matter how brutal the oppression. And it teaches us that the arc of history does indeed bend toward justice, even when that arc is long and painful and soaked in blood. Charles Deslandes failed in his immediate objective. He did not free the enslaved people of Louisiana. He did not reach New Orleans. He did not overthrow the system that oppressed him. But he succeeded in something perhaps more important. He demonstrated that black people would never stop fighting for their freedom. He proved that the slave system could only maintain itself through constant violence and terror. He showed the world that enslaved people were not the subhuman creatures that pro-slavery ideology claimed. His revolt was crushed, but his spirit was never broken. His body was mutilated and burned, but his memory survived. His story was buried for 200 years, but it has finally emerged into the light. And as long as people remember what he did, as long as they tell the story of that January night in 1811, Charles Destrehan will never truly die. The heads on poles have long since rotted away. The men who ordered the executions have turned to dust. The system they fought to protect has been consigned to the ash heap of history. But the dream that Charles Destrehan carried with him on that march toward New Orleans lives on. It lives in every struggle for justice. It lives in every movement for freedom. It lives in every person who refuses to accept oppression as their fate. This is the true legacy of the German Coast Uprising, not the defeat, but the defiance, not the death, but the courage, not the erasure, but the eventual remembering. Charles Destrehan lost the battle, but he helped win the war. And now, finally, the world is beginning to understand what he and his men accomplished on those January nights so long ago. They did not just fight for themselves. They fought for all of us. They fought for the principle that every human being deserves to be free. They fought for the idea that no system built on brutality and exploitation can stand forever. They fought for a future they would never see. For children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would inherit a world transformed by their sacrifice. The German Coast Uprising was America's largest slave revolt. It was also America's most forgotten. But the forgetting is finally coming to an end. Remember their names, remember their courage, remember their dream, and never forget what they taught us about the price of freedom.